Sheila. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion because I know, there are people here who've got a huge amount of experience and knowledge. Um, so yes. And obviously like, very a very serious time that we are facing. So yes, so I'm going to be looking at the Trump victory, what that looks like it's going to mean, for the world, then looking at the role of the new British government, what role that's playing under Keir Starmer, and then, sort of what CND is doing, what we can be doing together, that sort of thing. So yeah, so looking firstly at the election of Donald Trump in November. I mean, obviously, this is a terrible threat to all women across the globe. Women's bodies are under attack, not just, the attacks on women's access to abortion in the US, but, as we saw last time under Trump, there was this unprecedented expansion of the global gag rule, with huge cuts to US aid for women's reproductive rights programs, across the world. And certainly, looking at Trump's track record in relation to sort of war and nuclear weapons, and the Ultra Hawks, that he's planning to put into the State Department, this threat of war and nuclear confrontation, looks higher than ever. Certainly last time he was president, the US bombed Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, carried out extrajudicial killings, developed usable nuclear weapons. Under his leadership, the US withdrew from landmark nuclear arms control treaties, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. That's all to do with these long-range missiles. The Open Skies Treaty, that was about kind of transparency, for other sort of countries to feel reassured, to sort of reduce tensions, and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was this very carefully put together framework that was to sort of try and ensure that Iran, stayed within the NPT and wasn't sort of moving towards developing nuclear weapons. And in return, the US would end, the huge levels of sanctions against that country. But Trump just walked away from that, and of course withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. So, very, very serious. And again, it's women who are and will be most impacted. According to a 2023 UN report, the number of women and girls living in conflict-affected countries reached 614 million in 2022, and that was a 50% increase in the numbers in 2017. So really, really huge. We know that in relation to the use of nuclear weapons in war and nuclear testing, studies show that women are biologically more vulnerable to harmful health effects of ionizing radiation than men. The United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research carried out a study of the lifespan of survivors of the 1945 US weapons attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it found that the risk of developing and dying from cancer was nearly twice as high for women as it was for men, due to the levels of these sort of gender-specific cancers, female breast cancer, that sort of thing. And we know that nuclear testing by the US, Britain, and France across the Pacific Islands, Mexico, and Australia has had a disproportionate impact on women and girls. Pregnant women exposed to nuclear radiation face a greater likelihood of delivering children with physical malformations, stillbirths, leading to increased maternal mortality. So that's, we know that these impacts are absolutely horrific when it comes to the impact on women. And now we have the threat of a Trump administration restarting atmospheric testing. The US, didn't ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and certainly Trump advisors have been calling for the US to restart underground nuclear testing This is incredibly dangerous. Not only in terms of the US sort of, starting to carry out these atmospheric tests, but also in terms of other states following suit. More and more countries reverting to atmospheric testing. So CND wants to help build a global campaign to defend the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And we know that, it was back in the 60s, it was women, mothers who totally led the campaign to secure the ban on nuclear testing. And it's going to be women that will need to be at the forefront of this campaign again. In terms of, the ultra hawks that Trump's is planning to put into the State Department, people like Marco Rubio is likely to be nominated for Secretary of State. Mike Waltz has been appointed the National Security Advisor. They support Trump's maximum pressure approach on Iran, which is like more and more sanctions and this very, very confrontational approach towards Iran. And certainly, as we've seen, Trump's victory has only strengthened Netanyahu's expansionist project. Trump's openly supported annexing of the West Bank, and we're seeing the ongoing horror of a nuclear-armed Israel carrying out a genocidal war that is now worsening in terms of the levels of famine right across Gaza. So you have sort of starvation as a weapon of war. And now, of course, Israel is using the rapid collapse of Assad's leadership in Syria to expand its military occupation further into the US-administered buffer zone, as it's called, in the Golan Heights. So it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous, very volatile situation, and I think there's a very real risk of a confrontation with Iran. And again, it's been women that have been disproportionately impacted by this genocidal war. In its evidence to the International Court of Justice, South Africa stated that at least 70% of Palestinians reportedly killed in Gaza are believed to be women and children, and the majority of wounded Palestinians are also women and children. Women's reproductive rights have also been a site of conflict. The ruling of the ICJ on Israel highlighted, one of the articles of the Genocide Convention, that's the attempt to prevent women from giving birth. And in their case, South Africa cited the deliberate targeting of hospitals that has had a devastating impact on women's lives, on their ability to survive, to give birth, and for their babies to survive. So we've had massive increase in premature births, reportedly an increase of 25 to 30%. And we just think about those pregnant women struggling to give birth in the conditions that they're in now in these refugee camps, which are just rife with disease, as well as sort of military bombardment. So certainly for our work at CND, as well as continuing to call for a ceasefire and arms embargo, we really are, opposing the widening of a war and a confrontation with Iran, and we're really upping our support for a nuclear weapons-free Middle East. Then I wanted to look in more detail at the situation in Ukraine. So Biden's response to Trump's election has been to massively escalate the situation there, due to Trump's claims that he's going to bring, the war to a rapid conclusion, which, why would we believe Trump? Despite concerns that giving Ukraine use of its long-range missiles would draw NATO into an all-out confrontation with Russia, this is what Biden has done. And the British government has followed suit with its Storm Shadow missiles, even though it is still not publicly admitted that it is given permission. These missiles, they can only be targeted by US technology, like GPS technology. And so the US is decisively participating in this conflict. We know that Russia has ratified the change of its nuclear use policy, like reducing the threshold directly in response to this escalation. So this policy states that, use of nuclear weapons against a conventional attack by a non-nuclear state is possible if it's backed by a nuclear state. So that's basically, NATO's backing of Ukraine. And Russia's, also responded with this intermediate range hypersonic missile, the Orezhnik. And it's a very, very serious and rapid escalation. And this takes place in the context of the US's like new nuclear buildup of NATO bases across Europe. We've certainly now seen like satellite imagery that shows that the nuclear shelters at Lakenheath in Suffolk, one of the very big sort of US NATO base in Britain. They have now already been upgraded, ready to station these new B6112 nuclear bombs early next year. And we know that in July, the US announced that it will be deploying new long-range missiles in Germany from 2026. And these missiles had been destroyed under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, but under Trump, the US administration, withdrew, as I say, from that treaty in order to start development again. But military experts and diplomats across the political spectrum, including in Ukraine, have said that the use of these long-range missiles will and are making no decisive difference to the outcome of the war. And reports have shown that Ukraine has lost like 40% of the territory it had gained in its offensive in Kursk in the summer. And also this escalation is totally counter to the majority of public opinion in Ukraine now. The majority of people want an urgent end to this war through peace talks. And also across Western Europe, very, very large majorities, like in the 90%, also want an end to the suffering, an urgent end to the suffering through a negotiated settlement. So it looks like this escalation led by Biden is actually being determined by domestic politics in the US. Is Biden trying to sort of secure a more favorable situation for Ukraine going into the talks? But can Trump even secure such a ceasefire or political settlement? There's absolutely no guarantee that he can do that. Or is Biden just trying to sort of stop, Ukrainian sort of like military defeat, a complete collapse on his watch, and he wants to sort of try and push that into January. So that's what Trump has to deal with. Who knows? But certainly, sort of fears from sort of NATO hawks that Trump's going to sort of pull out NATO from Europe. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that's going to happen at all. In fact, the contrary. In his previous presidency, Trump was going around Europe like putting pressure on NATO states to increase their defense spending, and he's doing exactly the same thing again. Talking about 3% or even 4% of GDP going on defense spending. So what we're actually seeing is this pressure by the US to make Europe take more of the economic burden of projecting US military and nuclear power across Europe. And so certainly, strengthening our cooperation and our coordination with peace movements in the US and across Europe is absolutely critical in terms of, opposing this sort of in sort of strengthening of NATO and this increasing sort of militarism. It's very, very important that we do that. So then moving on to the role of the British government under Starmer. So obviously the new government, made support for nuclear weapons and replacement of the Trident submarine system an absolute kind of core commitment. I don't know if people saw the rather chilling animation, the video animation that came out during the election, which was like these little Trident submarines, like, sort of patrolling the shores of like Britain, and then sort of saying, oh, how many nuclear, submarines we have and how many warheads they had. To me, it felt like a kind of Cold War sort of propaganda, as if like, isn't this great? Isn't this great? We've got these nuclear weapons. And I think that's kind of been the approach, all the way through. We've got the Strategic Defence Review, which is coming up in spring. And that's all about justifying the increase in defence spending to 2.5% of national income. Starmer's government, has been, central to increasing tensions over Ukraine. He's been, people saw the sort of the mayoral banquet speech where he's like whipping up the threat of an expansionist Russia, which is not only to bolster a continued war in Ukraine, but it's also to justify the central role of the defence industry in Britain's economic growth. And so whilst Defence Secretary John Healey has presented the government's defence industrial strategy as a necessary response to a much more unstable and insecure world, it is Britain's aggressive militarism that is totally contributing to this very instability. And, the reality is that Starmer's government is trying to justify the billions it is pouring into military aid to Ukraine and defence spending, and the billions more it plans to spend to reach this 2.5% of GDP goal as something that is beneficial to the British population, something that is more beneficial than alleviating child poverty, more beneficial than halting pensioner winter deaths, more beneficial than scaling up investment in renewables. But of course, you can't build sustainable growth on genocide, global militarism, and the threat of nuclear war. More nuclear warheads don't offer any security to people losing their homes due to flooding, or women unable to feed their children, or older people dying of hypothermia this winter. And of course, if you're just being hard-nosed about it, the nuclear industry can't create the millions of jobs needed to build a strong, dynamic, sustainable economy. Whereas investing the hundreds of billions in the renewables sector, in carbon neutral house building programs, and in massively upskilling and expanding the social care sector, these all would do that, not nuclear weapons. So I think there's no surprise that the Starmer government, and Starmer in particular, is so unpopular. In fact, he's the least popular leader out of all of the political parties in Britain at the moment. This is kind of unprecedented. And it's clear that unless the government shifts away from this relentless militarism at the expense of people's real security, it will lose even more support. So what is CND doing? So we've been working flat out to put pressure on the British government to end the escalatory role in Ukraine, and we're calling on the government to pull out these Storm Shadow missiles. We've had getting letters in the mainstream media. We did a hand in to the Prime Minister with various MPs. We're mobilising members to lobby their MPs on this issue. We did have an emergency day of action, but this really shows you how that you've got these two threats of like climate chaos and nuclear annihilation, where there was this huge weather warning threat, which made it really difficult for people to mobilize. But coming up, we've got a webinar next Wednesday with retired US Colonel Anne Wright. I'm sure a lot of people will know her on this call, as well as the German MP Sevim Dagladem, to talk about the impact of Trump, looking at the role of NATO, as well as the situation in Ukraine, to start to continue to build that cooperation and that coordination. So I'll put the link in the chat, but it'd be great if people can come along to that. I think it'll be really, really interesting. CND is also supporting the sort of the anti-Trump alliance that came into existence last time he was president. That's, that will be kind of happening again, and there'll be a protest against Trump's inauguration around the 20th of January. So we will definitely be part of that. We're also organising a bases tour in 2025. And this is about shining the spotlight on Britain's nuclear weapons, as well as Britain's role in the wider sort of US war drive. So on the 22nd of March, we're going to be having a protest at BAE Systems, the factory and the dockyard at Barrow-in-Furness. This is where Britain's current nuclear submarines are sort of maintained and repaired, as well as, the building of the new submarines, these dreadnoughts. But also, people will know BAE, they make parts for the F-35A fighter jets, which have been and continue to be used by Israel in its genocide against the Palestinian people. So we'll be highlighting both of those. But also the safety risks. I'm sure people, read about the fire at Barrow that was inside the dock hall where the submarines are based. It was a fire that went on for 14 hours. It was a very, very sort of severe fire. One of the Astute class submarines was involved. All the tiles on the outside of that submarine were burnt. So we don't know how serious that damage is, but it certainly is very, very worrying. So we'll be highlighting the safety risks as well as, in terms of that regional area, but obviously globally as well. Then on the 26th of April, we're going to be up at Lakenheath. I'm sure people are aware that the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace is organising a peace camp in April. And we're going to be, encouraging our members to be part of that. But we're focusing very much on a blockade, which is taking place on the 26th of April. And again, that's showing, shining a spotlight on this base, which is at the heart of this NATO escalation and the continuing kind of threat, the nuclear risk going on in relation to Ukraine. But of course, also the stationing of the F-35A jets, and again their role in the genocide. Then in June, we're going to be going down to Devonport, again protesting against the huge amount of money that this government is spending on Trident and its replacement. It's way over 200 billion. Even the government's own kind of economic sort of watchdog, the National Audit Office, has said that the costs are it's unaffordable, and the Ministry of Defence is basically sort of using a contingency fund as a kind of blank check for sort of overruns, and so we're highlighting that. And then we're also going to be going to Aldermaston to support the Women's Peace Camp, highlight the development of the new warheads. And also, highlight this whole thing of trying to kind of rebrand nuclear weapons. I don't know if people have seen this, but they've spent, lots of money on rebranding Aldermaston to try and lure in new recruits, and they've kind of got rid of the Electron logo. So they're trying to kind of make it look less nuclear to try and attract people. So we'll be down there saying, this is where Britain's nuclear bombs are, and it's, we want to get rid of them. And then just finally, we're working really hard to bring in trade unionists and students into our activism. It's absolutely crucial that they're part of our campaign, confronting the increased militarism of education, as well as this drive to push people into a future of war, and the war economy. It's really important that we do that work. We ran a series of adverts on the heightened nuclear dangers on London undergrounds near universities, and also ran online adverts linked to a petition calling for an end to the escalation and against nuclear disarmament. And we got thousands and thousands of new supporters signing up. So I suppose, my conclusion really is that, the dangers are are huge. You know, we know that the situation we face is incredibly serious. And the challenges are incredibly serious. But these increased changes are also bringing in new layers of activists into our movement. There's a much higher level of awareness about the threat of nuclear weapons and a much higher level of people wanting to do something about it. And I think also this is reflected in the kind of wider culture. You know, films like Oppenheimer, which I don't know about you, but when I first heard about it, I was really worried that it was going to be sort of about glamorizing the use of nuclear weapons. And for those who've seen that film, I think, you know, it's clear that that certainly is not the case. But also the BBC's decision to reshow Threads, you know, its 40th anniversary. There's lots of sort of cultural things kind of happening, lots of plays and stuff like that about sort of the nuclear threat. So it's really, I think, sort of an expression of a greater awareness, and also people trying to sort of understand this and, you know, want to do something about it. And of course, you know, the role of women in this movement, in the peace movement, it will be as critical as ever. You know, it's always been women who have played, you know, an absolutely very, very high level of political leadership within our campaigns. You know, the huge demonstrations against cruise and Pershing missiles, you know, that took place. Women played a leading role in that. I mean, Greenham is kind of like iconic for that. But also lots and lots of women are leading struggles for peace now. You know, it's women who are playing leadership roles in running the encampments in universities to cut investment in Israel. It's women taking action on climate change, you know, Just Stop Oil protesters taking non-violent direct action. And it's overwhelmingly women leading the opposition to this Trump presidency. So, you know, I think we should take heart from that. We should be proud of the history, the tradition of, you know, the inspirational role that women are playing in fighting for a better world, for a world of peace, a nuclear-free world, a sustainable world for all of us, and seize like every opportunity we can to raise the issue of nuclear disarmament. And with, you know, 2025, it's the 80th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Couldn't be more critical for us, could it, to say never again. So thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks. Are you not able to unmute, Sheila?
Sheila, can you?
Got there. Sorry, everyone. Thank you so much, Sophie, for such an amazing run through all the issues and problems that face us. It makes me feel that I want to get into bed and put the duvet around my head. In spite of everything you've been saying about the new strength that's coming into CND. But I'm welcoming you all to come back to Sophie about your views on what she's been saying, and see if we can change our set into a more positive one. Who wants to lead us? Well, can I say something about what Wilf has been doing a lot about climate justice, and both here and internationally with International Wilf. And what we've been trying to do increasingly at all these fora like COP29 is to show how strongly militarization is affecting the crisis in the climate. And in fact, we've made some progress there. And we've got quite an alliance. And I think what we have to do is to make alliances, because there are so many organizations. It's not an issue of saying, oh, leave this and go into that, because I expect probably everyone here is a member of CND, as well as being members of WILF. And we recognize that we work together. We're in the Lake and Heath Alliance and so on. But we all have a particular focus. And I was very pleased to see how much you've shown the need for a feminist focus on the issues around nuclear weapons. We're just beginning to bring climate activists into the peace movement or the anti-nuclear movement. I think that is important. Yes, Diane. You're
muted.
Are you struggling like I was?
Somebody's doing the opposite when I try and unmute. Anyway, I totally agree. And actually here in Bath, we work together with Extinction Rebellion. We happen to be in both the peace and nuclear disarmament campaigns and XR. And being able to do actions together, it really, they get it, and they've joined in organising with us. And I think that's really important, because there are so many ways of saying it, two routes to extinction, they just are. And they drive each other in both directions. And yeah, the interesting bit is the throwing in the nuclear option, because of course that's going to take the climate in a totally opposite direction if and when it happens, because then you're talking about nuclear winter. But no, I think it's hugely important, and rightly climate has become, I mean, over my lifetime, it's been environmentalism for a decade or two, and then CND or whatever comes back again as the front runner. I mean, what, the 60s, the 80s, and I hope now it's going to be really up there again. But I think we have to do both, and I think they have to be seen to be mutually driving. Almost, yeah. Well, it's not interdependent. I mean, they're both about domination, which is the kind of the totem of masculinity, isn't it? And we don't want it. It's not good for people, and it's not good for the planet in either direction. So we have to go for it.
Thank you, Diana. Yes, Pat.
Sophie, thank you very much for going through all of that. That was absolutely a brilliant discussion. There are so many dangers in this world at the moment. And Trump, of course, is a major danger all of himself. But one of the many things that I was thinking about when I was listening to the news was Iran. And it's been weakened by the recent events. And nobody's really been talking about this, but it occurred to me that we'd stopped this treaty that was going to block them from developing their nuclear weapons. And with them being in a weakened state, there's a danger, I think, that they might decide that they'd get their nuclear weapons going again. That's one of the things. And associated with that, of course, it was Trump that stopped it. Trump is absolutely unpredictable. And there's really two questions here, because the other question is, do we think there's any chance that when he gets into office again, he'll be a little bit more amenable to the practicalities of the dangers of the world?
I would say not, because he's surrounding himself with absolutely off the wall mavericks and crazy people. It's this is the don't know how to say this. We seem to be facing almost insurmountable issues around Trump, and we have Starmer, who in theory should be more measured, and yet he's been following the American lead in virtually everything. You want to come in on any of these points, Sophie?
Yes, definitely. Yes. No, that was I mean, I agree with all of that. And I think it's really great that that Wilf is also totally understanding that we've got to everything is interlinked. And I think because things are so much more dangerous, that everything's it's much starker, isn't it? The choices that people have, but also the interconnectedness between the drive to war, the drive to nuclear war, climate chaos, but also in terms of like global injustice, all of that. It's all completely sort of interlinked. I mean, in terms of the the work around sort of strengthening that interconnectedness. I mean, CND organised a conference in October that was about the world that we want, and the key sort of purpose of that was to bring together these alliances through the climate justice movement, through the environmental movement, to show, to talk through, like to show like how how these issues are interconnected. And it was about sort of it's about kind of helping, sort of this kind of mutual support of those movements, rather than kind of going, hey, look, all you climate change activists, you should be campaigning against nuclear disarmament. It's saying, we totally recognize that the military blueprint, is completely driving climate chaos, and therefore campaigning against militarism has to be part of a campaign that's trying to sort of halt climate chaos. So sort of doing it that way. And so we're going to be doing, we're going to start off with sort of webinars, doing more work with War on Want, and, Friends of the Earth, and, those kind of organizations, but also looking at the sort of jobs diversification. So, moving from militarism into green jobs. There's a lot of work that's happening around that, and they're all completely, interrelated. So people might have picked up the sort of the new kind of Lucas plan. This was somebody who's interviewed people who are working in the nuclear industry and the sort of the arms industry, and talking to them about what sort of work they would like, and how so many of them would like to be working in the sort of environmental, sort of sustainable energy sectors, and sort of starting those conversations. So I think, yeah, it's very, very important. I mean, certainly in relation to, the point about like this sort of being the two routes to extinction, absolutely spot on, and how they drive each other. And I think that this issue around like what's going on with Starmer, I think they are just feeling that they have to totally demonstrate in the most kind of heavy-handed way possible, that they are totally supporting, you know, the nuclear industry. That's an absolute like focus. They are this safe pair of hands for the military. So I'm sure people would have like picked up on this. But you know, the British government was lobbying against a UN vote for a study to be set up looking at the effects of nuclear war. And there was a kind of an outcry about this. You know, why on earth would like the British government be not wanting to sort of like, you know, learn more about the effects of nuclear war? And you know, they sort of doubled down on it, voted against it. It was just them, Russia, and I think was another country, I can't remember, was it France maybe, that just, you know, voted against it. Like the US abstained, you know. So Britain was completely kind of isolated. But yeah, they doubled down and they just sort of said, we know what the effects of nuclear war are, you know, why on earth do we need another study? But the whole point was that, you know, that last study was 40 years ago, and since then there's been a huge amount of like you know, improvements in relation to kind of, you know, climatic modeling, you know, all this sort of stuff that shows that now a much smaller regional like nuclear conflict could create the nuclear winters that we're talking about. You know, whereas previously they thought it was, you know, it would be kind of like have to be kind of a worldwide sort of nuclear war. So things like that, you know, there's been, but again, you know, there's been a huge condemnation about that. You know, CND was working with MPs, you know, lobbying David Lammy about that, and that brought together, you know, a good strong coalition of Labour MPs, Greens, Plaid, SNP. So I think it kind of shows you, you know, that this sort of almost kind of extreme approach that they're taking means that there are opportunities to kind of bring together sort of good political alliances against that. And then the point that Pat, well, the questions that Pat was asking about, you know, the situation with Iran. I mean, that's, you know, that's our big concern. And so we are just, so we're wanting to raise awareness about the JCPOA, to sort of say, look how important this treaty was, look how important this agreement was. It was, you know, it was the US that trashed it. We need to get this back again. This is absolutely critical because, you know, as you rightly say, when Iran is under so much attack, you know, like Israel, like Netanyahu came out publicly to say, yes, we did attack Iran's nuclear facilities. You know, we did. That sort of the more like hardline elements within sort of the Iranian, you know, government are going to be saying, look, what are we doing? We should just be getting on and, you know, developing nuclear weapons. So obviously, you know, we don't want that. So but also that's incredibly dangerous for the whole region. You know, then you've got another situation where you've got potentially like another, you know, two nuclear armed states, you know, having a nuclear confrontation. So again, I think because that situation is so serious and so dangerous, it is, you're more likely to be able to get like a greater sort of political alliances coming together against, you know, against that. So we're totally working, you know, within Parliament to try and bring that together and put pressure on. Do we think Trump's going to be more amenable or less? I mean, I feel this is a kind of the crux. I feel like this is a crux of like what's going on in the world and why it feels like things are, you know, on speed at the moment, which is, you know, the US is becoming more and more reckless. You know, and that's because it is no longer the global dominant power, you know, that it once was. Economically, it's now, you know, it's sort of been overtaken by China. You know, you've got like global South economies coming together in cooperation, you know, BRICS, that their combined economies are now, you know, much bigger than the G7. So you've got this sort of shifting of the global dynamics taking place, you know, in the world that is kind of challenging and moving away from this like unipolar world where it was just the US was kind of like police and, you know what I mean, judiciary and everything, that really has caused, just decades and decades of war, constant war, threat of sort of nuclear weapons, that that is kind of being challenged, which is a good thing, because it's totally unsustainable, and look where it's got us. But at the same time, the US is desperately trying to sort of maintain that dominance, and so it's becoming more and more reckless. I feel that that is shown in its what Biden's doing in Ukraine. I just think he's utterly reckless to sort of play nuclear chicken with Russia on this, knowing full well that it's you can't actually sort of really sort of change things there. And then the fact that the US is prepared to fund and politically support the genocide that Israel is carrying out against the Palestinian people. I mean, it's utterly horrific, and consequently it's like the world is seeing the US for kind of what it is. It's been completely exposed, but it doesn't care. It's kind of continuing. And as I say, I think that's because it's determined to try and maintain its dominance, and where it has its strength, it's losing its strength economically. Where it still has overwhelming superiority is militarily. You just look at like US defense spending compared to the rest of the world. You look at nuclear weapon spending, the US spends more than all the other nuclear armed states combined. So that's kind of what's going on. And that's why I think the stakes are so much higher now, that the US is prepared to challenge other nuclear armed states, whereas before it would kind of, take on Iraq, didn't have any nuclear weapons, you know what I mean? Afghanistan, it's now, potentially prepared to take on Russia and horrifically, China. So I think so in that context, I think, Trump might well be very reckless, but like that's sort of what the US is kind of now doing anyway. But I feel that because it is being so reckless now, it's like it sort of, doesn't care if it risks the entire planet. It means that more and more people are prepared to speak out and like want to do something about it. Like lots of people understand now the seriousness of Ukraine. You know what I mean? They understand the seriousness of what's going on in the Middle East, and they don't like it. They don't want it. So I think there's huge levels of opposition to this. I think the sort of the protests that we've had around Palestine are sort of an expression of that. And I think that what we have to do is to show the relevance of our campaigning, the seriousness, the urgency of our campaigning, and continue to do all the really important work that we're doing, like Wilf is doing, in terms of building these links with the climate movement, building the links with the sort of trade unions, in terms of kind of the economic side of things, and we're building that alliance so that we can get there, and we will stop the sort of attempt of a sort of another nuclear war, because we know that that's kind of what we're kind of facing. That's where things are going, and as I say, more and more people get that too. So it is it's very, very serious. It's very, very, very sort of dark time, but as I say, I think when you look back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, you look back to the 80s with the sort of nuclear arms race, then it was public protest that was decisive in shifting that, in terms of shifting that, but also securing like real change, in the 60s with the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and in the 80s with the you know, the INF Treaty, you know, which resulted in thousands of long-range missiles being destroyed, which, I mean, I think Reagan wanted to do that. You know, he was happy to kind of for Russia to be sort of disarmed, but it was public opinion. It was because like the huge mobilizations across Europe that were kind of, and so those political leaders were saying, look, you've got to, you know, you've got to shift, you've got to take some action here because we can't cope with the heat that we're getting from our population. So that's what we have to do.
Can I pick you up a bit on that public opinion?
Yeah.
On two things that you touched on, and I see as possibly crucial. One is the potential within Parliament to have an opposition within the Labour Party, or with the Labour Party and the small groups that there are around, to actually change any policies, because the government has made an enormous issue of, we are determined to do it this way, we're not going to change, we've got it right, you've got to follow us, and so on. That's the one thing. And the other is, when can we find anyone with power or influence who will actually stand up and say, Israel has no right to keep arguing anti-Semitism whenever anyone opens their mouths, because that's the way they close off all the comments on the things they're doing, right up to very today, where they're actually bombing into Syria, saying in self-defense. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And no one is prepared to stand up and say, this can't go on any longer. Yes, Diana.
I absolutely agree with everything that's being said, and thank you so much, Sophie, for your real encouragement. What I think we also need to do is we have to keep saying how dreadful the things that we are against are. I think we also need to start campaigning loudly for cooperation, because and here again, it's handy having the climate issue alongside us, because it's bloody obvious that you can't save the planet unless we cooperate. It's absolutely, and I mean, at least they're going through the pretense of the COP meetings. At least they're seeing they have to be talking. But what we need that on the war stuff as well. We need it globally as a human race, because otherwise we're stuck. And we need a great new cohort of diplomats for a start. I mean, they've shriveled the diplomatic service. We don't bother talking to people anymore. I mean, we're trying to make enemies of China. How foolish is that? We absolutely need lots of conversations, and conversations that say we're all in the same boat. There is only one boat that human beings can live in, so we have to share it. And we can do things together that we can't possibly do if we keep on fighting each other. And I don't know how you even begin to get that message across. I mean, Keir Starmer was always going to come and show that he was a hard man like the other ones, always. And it's pathetic. It's just pathetic. Sorry.
That's true. Shall I come back?
Why not?
Okay. So, I mean, so your point, Sheila's point about the sort of political, the democratic deficit which is, it's absolutely true, isn't it? Like more and more, there's just such a massive gap between what we have in Parliament and what people want, and what people, you know, believe. Is there a potential for, you know, opposition within the Labour Party? I mean, I think so, because I don't think they're going to let the kind of the independents, the sort of suspended MPs back in, you know. And so then you've got these MPs that are going to continue to be independent, who will let, I mean, I would imagine that it would be in their interest to be a bit more vocal, yeah. And they will have, like, you know, the independents that stood as independents and got elected as a kind of role model on this. So I think, you know, let's see, but that kind of is already sort of starting to happen. But I feel that you can kind of, in a way, you can kind of jump over you know, the sort of opposition with the Labour Party. Think about like the case of, say, Sarah Everard, and those like hugely powerful protests by women, you know, massive protests against what happened. That forced the Labour Party, as it was then, to oppose the policing bill. It was going to abstain. But those protests forced them to, shamed them into having to sort of vote against it. And I think that there is public opinion that can kind of sort of, you know, like kangaroo over the lack of opposition and force the government to act. I mean, I know it's small, but like they've been forced to suspend some of the export licenses to Israel, and now there's another legal challenge where it looks like they're, you know, they're going to be forced to do it again. So, and that's because of public opinion. So I feel like, I mean, that's partly why they're trying to silence and sort of suppress protest, because it is so effective. So I feel like, you know, that it will only kind of intensify for the government, because their failure to kind of to tackle the economic situation, you know, they're not going to be improving living standards. They're going to be you know, so therefore people are going to be continuing to need some sort of change. And then in terms of you know, which countries are sort of are brave enough to sort of stand up to Israel, well, it was South Africa, wasn't it? And I just feel that that moment was so significant and so incredible, and I just felt it completely changed the global dynamic on the issue of Israel, because it was the first time that you'd had, like, you had the ICJ talking, well, I mean, the ICJ voting, including an Israeli judge, voting that Israel was at risk of like committing genocide. So it was the first time that you'd had that in general mainstream discussion and discourse, Israel genocide. You know what I mean? So I think that has just completely politically isolated Israel and the US, and it is completely legitimized and given that kind of moral authority to our movement, to be able to sort of, you know, talk about what is going on and to articulate that this is a genocide. And I think it's also, you know, important to remember that we are in the global north, which is the worst, you know what I mean? It's the worst bit of the world in a way, isn't it, on this issue? Whereas the global south is just a whole different kind of dynamic going on there. And I think, again, like I come back to this whole development with the BRICS economy. You know, they're a lot more confident, these economies and these countries, to sort of say, no, we're not going to go along with you. I mean, you know, the sort of, they're not prepared to sort of go along with NATO on Ukraine, and that's only going to continue, because if you've had a situation where you've had a global world order that's about, you will do what is in our interest, i.e. the US, or we will invade you, you know what I mean, or we will organize a coup, or do you know what I mean? Like, after a certain amount of time, countries just aren't going to put up with that anymore. So I think there is, you know, there is a lot of hope. I feel like the global south is kind of leading the way. It's leading the way in terms of, you know, the struggle around climate, because, you know, it's these countries that are most, you know, they're already kind of suffering. They're the kind of hardest hit by it, and so they are having to sort of like, you know, bring about that change themselves in terms of the sort of economic, you know, changes in, as I say, in relation to kind of BRICS and others, is economic cooperation that is on issues like climate change and what have you, but also in relation to war and nuclear weapons. You know, they're the ones that kind of got the sort of the nuclear free zones and what have you. So so I think it's kind of taking heart from them, but also like linking up with them. You know, what more can we be doing to be bringing that, the voice of the global south, you know, this massive majority of the world's population, into our meetings, you know, into our discussions, so that we can have, you know, we can feel more hopeful, more inspired, because we're getting a better kind of a sort of fuller picture of what's really kind of going on in the world. And then just one final thing I will say, this point about like we're all in one boat and all that, and I totally agree with that. And I think that also comes, the other sort of intersection is around the kind of challenging racism, you know, standing up to the sort of the racism that we've got with sort of Farage, and you know what I mean, which is all about trying to sort of shore up this kind of jingoism and this sort of ultra kind of nationalism that's about you know, supporting an increase in defense. You know what I mean? You know, we do need a big army because we've got to go and fight Russia and all that sort of stuff. So it's kind of challenging that and breaking that down to say, well, you know, how is militarism sort of helping? How is that helping all the refugees, you know, who are dying in the Mediterranean? It's not. Do you know what I mean? So, but also it's racism that's used to sort of justify, you know, terrible, illegal wars. You know, if you think about like the way that, you know, the rise of Islamophobia in order to kind of justify the invasion of Iraq. You know, the sort of terrorists are here, the enemy within, and all that sort of stuff. So, and in fact, the British anti-war movement has been really amazing on that, really good on that, totally stood up to that racism and formed an alliance with the, you know, Muslim Association of Britain, CND, and Stop the War, to build this really strong anti-war alliance that stood up to all this Islamophobia, and that benefited all of those organizations. It also gave, like, you know, progressive voices within the Muslim community, like a much sort of like stronger sort of say, and it also like forced other sections within it to challenge their own racism. So I think that's equally very important, you know, on, for instance, now on the issue of, for instance, xenophobia, you know, all this stuff around anything to do with China is a threat, is like, you know, we should be seeing them as just wanting to kind of spy on us or what have you, you know, to kind of challenge all of that and say, what, you know, what's all this about? We've got to be working together here. Like, let's sort of, let's kind of end this sort of rhetoric of hate and division. You know what I mean? And we need to be kind of working together. We are all on the same planet. We are all in the same boat. Whoever said that, that was great.
Very good. But I heard this morning, I heard on the radio that recent polls had shown, and we know that Starmer's rating has gone down terribly, but that the one rating that had gone up was Farage's, what are they called, reform or something?
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, it's that, I mean, I didn't.
So that means that people, the populace that we're hoping to recruit, are still singing his song.
Well, I mean, I didn't include that in my speech because I was a bit like, okay, that is, you know, I know that I'm talking about a lot of challenging and and bad things, but to sort of to then talk about reform. But I mean, it's true. Like on that, what the British government is doing, what Labour is doing yet again, is it's trying to outright the far right, and you can't do that. They just can't do that. So all it's doing is it's just strengthening Farage. That's what it's doing, and Labour will just like collapse in terms of their polling. But that's another reason why it's absolutely crucial to challenge the racism of the far right and not let it go, because that's what the government's doing. They're saying, oh, people do have legitimate concerns, you know, all these people who were terrorizing communities in the summer, well, they have got legitimate concern. Well, you know, no, they don't. You know what I mean? Those concerns are not legitimate. Talking, you know, celebrating people being killed, or you know what I mean, dying in the Mediterranean. We have to challenge all of this. We have to say, why are these refugees being so desperate that they are forced to go into these dinghies in the first place? It's because of wars that we have instigated or been part of. You know what I mean? So we do have to challenge all that, because it's only by challenging all of that that you can get people to start thinking in a different way. Otherwise, it just becomes accepted, doesn't it? So yes, we definitely have to do that. But there is also a whole other section of the population that was very, very like voted Labour holding their nose, and you know, are now already, you know, supporting the Greens. Or do you know what I mean? The Greens did really well in the election because Labour was taking such a terrible position on everything. So, you know, there will be a whole section of the population who didn't vote because they just couldn't bring themselves to do it, but who are now supporting the Greens and, you know, independents and all that sort of stuff. So I feel for us, we have to mobilize those people. We have to engage with those people, you know, and there will be more and more of them who will be sickened by what Starmer is doing. And, you know, and a lot of those are young people, you know what I mean, who totally get that. And then also support those movements. It's a bit like the anti-Trump alliance. You know, there's obviously like fighting racism, standing up to the far right is obviously a big part of that alliance. You know, so it is all about kind of challenging that. That's very important too. But you know, and again, it's like all of these things are interlinked. And it's making sure that like our voice is sort of in there. Yeah.
Very good. Now, come on, all of you. Let's hear what you've got to say.
I'm trying very desperately to think of something positive. We've got to end on a positive note.
Okay. It's all right. You don't have to.
But can I ask a quick question? Can I ask you a quick question about the trade unions? I was interested that you're saying about the CND.
I know that's not a positive thing, is it?
No.
I know.
Now I'm a member of a retired member of a trade union, and my union Prospect is the most pro-nuclear union, and I just have it, but none of them come out, even GMB or any of the others, show any sign of trying to lay the groundwork or that things might have to shift. It's just a reactive no all the time, even to renewable energies or anything. In the work that you're seeing with trade unions in Parliament, maybe, or MPs, do you see any chinks, any signs that they're changing?
I think there's definitely a hardening of bad positions by the GMB and also Unite.
Right.
I think that's definitely the case. And it's kind of at the top level, isn't it? Where they're just kind of, I mean, there's as part of this defense industrial strategy, they're setting up a council which is sort of got the, you know, the sort of MOD, but it's also got the trade unions on it as well. So it is all about kind of trying to co-opt them on and all of that. So of course all of that stuff's going on, and this is, you know, they are selling it on the basis of the jobs.
Yeah.
But this is a massive flaw in their argument, which is that these industries are not they're not effective at really kind of developing real growth, because it's just a chunk of metal, you know, in a dockyard somewhere. Do you know what I mean? Whereas if you're providing, you know, jobs for the social care sector, that means, you know, that's somebody who can now freed up to go off and get a job. Do you know what I mean? And they will have more disposable income. So that means they can be buying more stuff. Do you know what I mean? That's a kind of virtual circle. Whereas the sort of chunk of metal in the dockyard, like how's that getting, you know, more jobs? So that is definitely work that CND is doing with the RMT. We're putting together an alternative defence review, and that will be part of that. But also we are, you know, we've sort of already done this work. It was People Not Trident. We did work with an economist, which proves exactly this. You know what I mean? That it was at the time, and it was done. It was like about 12,000 jobs in the nuclear industry, yeah, that weren't civilian. And you're spending 205 billion on it. You know what I mean? So it's completely, whereas if you were putting that money into, you know, research and development, universities, housing, all of that sort of stuff, it's just a complete other sort of ball game. So we're kind of updating and refreshing that, and it's kind of getting that out. So you're just, you know, to be able to expose the lies, I suppose. What else can you do? You know, you're saying, well, that's not enough, is it? Like, that's a fraction of the jobs we need. And also, what are you doing about climate change? So, yeah, it's, you know, it's like we're definitely in a minority, but we've got the solutions. You know, we've got the solutions. We know what's needed, and we're in a minority in the global north. You know, we link up with like huge states. I mean, like, whatever you think about China, like, they totally get that you've got to completely turn your economy around green energy. You know what I mean? They've got to get away from coal-fired, you know, power stations. So like they understand that, and because of all the investment that they're doing, it's bringing down the cost of solar panels and all that stuff for us here, you know. So
yeah, exposing the lies. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Go on, Diana.
Just briefly, I'm very much involved still with rethinking security.
Oh, excellent.
And they, you know, we did a human security review, I think. Yes. HSR, yes. And that was very powerful, actually, because what people felt gave them security was nothing to do with weapons and defense, so-called. It was all to do with cost of living, NHS working, and so actually telling people what is making you safe, or they'll tell you it won't be weapons.
No.
So I think that's a very helpful angle, and I'm glad that CND is part of the network. But also Richard Reed, the coordinator, is it keeps getting delayed post general election, but there's a human security strategy that's going to be coming out in the spring, I guess, now. And I think that will be helpful. And yes, it might be worth being in touch with Richard about that, because the more we can put that out there,
Yeah, definitely.
and or mine it for helpful things to say.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Promote it. Yeah. Okay. Would you be able to send me his email?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess I just have one very quick question to try and end on a positive note. Is obviously, as we've all been saying, like, everything does feel rather bleak. And there is a very strong, I guess, either governmental, international opinion that like nuclear weapons are what we need to protect the world. And like you say, you were sort of talking about ways that we can combat this, whether that's, you know, building alliances, trying to change the narrative amongst public opinion. But I just sort of wondered, like, when it does feel like sort of negative hit after negative hit, what keeps you hopeful and sort of feeling positive and, you know, optimistic about the movement?
Being part of the movement. You know, I think, I'm sure it's the same for everybody, like going on the demonstrations for Palestine is, I find, incredibly inspiring. I've made like new friends from going on those protests because you're going so regularly. You're with people who feel exactly the same way as you, who are, you know, equally horrified and, you know, keep going, you know, and are doing amazing things, like amazing sort of creative things all the time, trying to find ways to kind of get more people involved, keep people involved. So that, I think, the kind of the amazingness of humanity, like you think about, you know, the Hibakusha, you know, that obscene war crime that was committed against, you know, the Japanese people, and what did they create out of that? They have created this most powerful movement, like the most beautiful, moving ceremonies. You know what I mean? Like, so for me, it's the sort of the strength and the power and the kind of beauty of humanity that will overcome all of this. And there are a lot, you know what I mean? There are lots of us, and also, you know, like the media, I mean, you know what I mean? The media is so unrepresentative now, you know, even what it always was, but like even more so now, that there are a lot, like way more people than we realize that think the same as us, you know. And also, you know, like is only a fraction of you know, the world's countries that have nuclear weapons and even think that they are, you know, that we should have them. The vast majority of the countries like, no, this is terrible, and, you know, a obscene waste of money, and like this massive sort of risk to the planet. So yeah, I think if I wasn't involved in activism, I would be very stressed and, do you know what I mean, disempowered and all of that, and like watching a lot more reality TV or whatever. This sounds terrible, but, you know, being involved in activism is like is our way, isn't it? Like doing what we can to try and make the world better and stop it from getting worse. So that's why I have to keep going.
Thank you.
And it works. I mean, and also it does, you know, we do change things. That's the thing that we have to remember. We definitely do.
Mhm.
All right then. Also,
Thank
I really love your curtains, Anne.
They've been there years, can't you tell?
Oh, they're really lovely. They're really vibrant.
Well, anyone with a last statement or question or intervention or discussion point? This is your last chance. For our next webinar, which will be sometime in January, we're going to have a report back from our young, a very lively member from Scotland who was able to, was supported by Wilf International to attend COP29. And it's, again, after disappointment, it's really good to hear positive outcomes that people can draw from them. So that's our message tonight. Positive outcomes are available to us. And you've put into the chat what's coming up. What's coming up on the 18th?
CND webinar
on the Wednesday the 18th.
So
good, very good. So many thanks, Sophie. You kept us very aware and thinking and positive. I hope that you're happy that we've recorded all this discussion as well as your presentation, because it will be very good to have that on our website where we can direct our friends to a very positive, drawing from the negative, the positive. Thank you, Sophie, and all strength to you for the future.
Oh, thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
It's been a pleasure. It's been really, really lovely. Thank you. I look
Good.
forward to seeing you all in person at some point.
Yeah, you will.
All right then.